How you doing there? Welcome back to Babble on Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Kuf Zayin, Daf 107. Wow, Mamish moving here. Masechta Chullin, unbelievable. Daf 107. Another interesting daf here at Masechta Chullin. We are continuing to talk about, so the three sections I got here. The first section is more halachos of netilas yadayim. It's kind of some of the technicalities of netilas yadayim. Still interesting, though a little bit technical in the first section. Middle section is wrapping your hands in a cloth. It might not sound as interesting as it is. Maybe I could have made it more interesting or sounding. But wrapping your hands in a cloth, what does that mean? It means that, well, if the whole point of doing netilas yadayim for bread is because your hands are tameh and you don't want to touch the bread, what if you just wrap your hands in a cloth? What if you don't have water? Can you just not touch the bread? Eat it in a plastic? I don't know. Interesting question, right? And finally, being fed bread. What if somebody feeds you? What if somebody feeds you? You're not touching anything. You have to wash your hands if being fed bread. Does the person who's feeding have to wash his hands? Anyways, friends, these are what we have to look forward to and Daf Kuf Zayin, Daf 107 of Masechta Chullin. So come join me. Let's have a great time. Friends, we begin Daf Kuf Vav Amid Beis, 2 lines from the bottom. Amar Rav says, Rav, Notel Adam es shtei yadav shachris, umasna lein kol ayom kulo. Says Rav, a person can wash his hands in the morning, and then he's good from the day. What does Rashi say? Umasne la'achila uvavad she'yizar militan fam militam Says Rashi, you can wash your hands in the morning, and that'll just kind of work for all of your eatings throughout the day. Right? Again, nota adam hashtei of shachris. You can wash your hands in the morning. Umasne leim kol yom kulo, and say, and this is going to be for the whole day, and just be careful not to get tummy or anything like that. Amalu Rav Avina livnei Piksa de Arvus. Rav Avina said to the people of Piksa de Arvus, Kigon atun de lo shchiche lechumaya. You chever, you don't have a lot of water in Piksa de Arvus. So mishu yadaychu mitzafra ve'asnu alayu lechuliyom. Just wash your hands in the morning, once in the morning, and say, and this is going to be for the whole day. So those who say that this can only work in a shas adachak, in a place where in a very, very difficult situation where there's literally a lack of water. But if there is water available, you would be unable to do this tonight thing. And that would argue on Rav, who didn't seem to place any limitations on the possibility of making such a stipulation. Those who say that Rabbi Avinu was advising the people of Piksa Darvus, even if there was no emergency, they could still make such a tonight, they could still make such a condition, a stipulation, and that would be consistent with Rav, who did not put any limitations on the ability to make a Tanai on netilas yadayim for the whole day. Amar Papa says, Rav, Papa, you can change it to Rav. It'll make it consistent with the upcoming Gemaras. Let's do that. Amar Rav says, Rav, Hai arisa didaloe. Okay, ein not limimenu liyadayim. Okay, okay. Now we got to slow down for this next little section. So this is talking about. Okay, slow down. Amar Rav says, Rav, Hi arisa didaloi. So an arisa didaloi is a canal that had water in it. And from the water, they would fill up buckets and pour those buckets into ditches. Now, of course, netilas yadayim is you basically scoop up some water, whether in a cup or in this case in a bucket. And netilas yadayim is you take the water and you pour it from the vessel onto your hands. Now, what they would do here is there would be these canals, and these canals would run by their fields. They would take these buckets and scoop up water with the buckets and pour them into these ditches. And from the ditches, they would then go out and irrigate. From the water would spread from the ditches into their fields, and that was part of the irrigation system. But basically, there would be water that was being bucketed into these ditches. And the question is, what if a person plunged his hand into one of the ditches? What if he plunged his hands into one of the ditches? Right, as we know, of course, as we learned yesterday, if we're talking about a kosher mikvah or a kosher spring, just like you could tovel your whole body in the mikvah or the spring, you could plunge your hands into there, and that would work as the equivalent of netilas yadayim. Over here, however, you're scooping up the water in a bucket, which makes it mayim she'uvin. This is not a kosher mikvah or mayan or anything. This ditch. It's mayim she'uvin, water that was drawn out from the canal in a bucket, in this case. So therefore, you can't just plunge your hand into the ditch. There is an interesting question, though, that the Gemara asks. What if you stand and plunge your hands into the ditch close to where the bucketer is pouring the bucket into the ditch? So then, if that's the case, then the force of the pouring would actually be hitting your hand. If you're further down the ditch, so then already any force of the pouring is already worn out, and it's just kind of like on its own momentum at that point. But if you get close enough to where the bucketer is pouring the water, well, then the force of the pouring is what's going to be interacting with your hand, which is essentially netilas yadayim. You take a vessel and you pour it onto your hand. So here also it would be being poured into your hand, essentially. So with that information, let's see what we have over here. So Amar Rav says, Rav, hi arisa de daloi, this, what do I call it, a canal? Sure. This canal that they would fill up buckets from the canal and pour those buckets into ditches. You can't plunge your hands into the ditch as an equivalent of netilas yadayim. You can't do that. Because the water downstream in the ditch is no longer coming from the force of the person who is pouring the water from the bucket into the ditch. It has its own momentum at that point. However, the mikariv legabe davla dikaasu mikoach gavra. But if you get closer to where the bucketer is pouring the buckets, so that the water that will be getting on your hands and sort of pouring over your hands is coming from the force of the person who's pouring the buckets into the ditch. So he's not pouring the water over your hands specifically, he's pouring it into the ditch. But if you get close enough to where that's taking place, the force of the pouring is what's going to be reaching your hands. So that would work. You could stick your hands, you could plunge your hands into the ditch at that section of it, and that would be a kosher equivalent of netilas yadayim, because essentially water from a vessel is being not poured directly on, but essentially poured at your hands, and the force of that pouring is what is washing your hands. Now, if, however, the bucket had a hole in it, now there's we could talk about two types of holes. One type of hole we could talk about is a hole that is motzi mashke. You have a bucket and it's got a crack in it, let's say, and water is slowly leaking out, but it's just a little crack. Like water wouldn't be able to get into the bucket through that crack, but water can leak out through it. A larger hole would be something that's kones mashke, a hole that's big enough that water can even get into the bucket via that hole. So if there's a hole in the bucket that's kones mashke, it's big enough that water can get in. And essentially, as this person is pouring water into the ditch from the bucket, at the same time, water is streaming out from the bottom of the bucket via this hole. And essentially what you have this bucket in the middle, water streaming out the back and arcing a stream into the canal that it's coming from. And you have the water being poured into the ditch. And essentially everything is connected. You have the water in the ditch, which is being poured and there's a stream of water that is kind of connecting from the bucket into the ditch, and there's also a stream of water connecting from the bucket into the canal, and it's all kind of like one connection. Well, in that case, you can even plunge your hands into the ditch at any point because it's all one channel at that point. If there's a hole in the bucket that is large enough for water to get into the bucket, and water is leaking out and streaming out into the canal, mela fly face, it's all considered connected, and then the original concern that we had, which is, well, it's not the koach of the person pouring it, that becomes moot. It goes away because it's all just one connected stream of water. In that scenario, it's all just considered the canal. I'm going to chapash l'kati, we'll go back to. Okay, Givaldik. That was probably the most technical part, which wasn't even that difficult, I don't think. What do you think? V'amar says, Rabbi, kli shenikev bekonis mashke. If you have a vessel that has a hole in it large enough for water to get into the vessel from it, ein noten mimenu liyadayim, you can't use it for washing your hands. If it's got a big enough hole in it, it's broken. You can't use it. V'amar Rabban says, Rabbi, kli she'ein bo revius, ein noten mimenu liyadayim. A vessel, it might be a large vessel, but if there's less than a revius halog, a quarter of a log, that's 1.5 eggs worth. If there is less than a revius of water in it, you can't use it for netilas yadayim. You have to have a minimum amount of water in it, and that is a revius. Ini, is that so? Rava says, Rava klisha ein machzik revius enod mimenu liyadayim. I thought Rava says that a vessel that is too small, so small that it can't even hold a revius of water if it wanted to, that is what is pasul. But so long as a machzik, if it is capable of holding a revius of water, afagav delays, right? So as long as it's capable of holding a revius of water, it doesn't actually have to have a revius of water. So on the one hand, Rav is saying you need a revius of water. On the other hand, he's saying you don't need a revius of water. You just need a vessel that's big enough to be able to hold a revius of water. So which one is it? Lokasha, it's no problem. Ha lichad, ha litrei. It depends if we're talking about for one person or for two people. The Tanan that we learned in the Mishnah, the first Mishnah in Masechta Yadayim. Can you imagine? There's a whole Masechta about washing your hands. To be honest, I'm looking forward to getting there because I want to know more of these halachos. May revius notlin leyodayim leechad vafilu lishnaim. That a revius is enough for one person and even for two. What does this mean? It means the following: that if for one person to wash netilas yadayim, you need to have a revius. Now, if you have two people that are going to wash netilas yadayim, you can also just have a revius, and you would pour from the vessel onto the first person, and what's left over could then be used for the second person. But so the second person maybe is going to have less than a revius, right? Meaning you have two people, you have a total of revius, you pour on the first person, whatever is left over, which is obviously less than a revius, is going to be for the second person. But you can't milichatchila start with less than a revius, and that's what we're saying. On the one hand, Rava says you can have less than a revius, and on the other hand, he's saying you need to have a revius. The answer is you need to start with a revius. And if there's only one person there, you're going to have a revius. If there's two people, well, then you'll start with the revius, but then the second person has what's left over, and that will even be less than a revius, and that's okay too. So when we're talking about less than a revius, we're talking about less than a revius that's left over from the original revius that had already been poured on the first individual. Omarle, it says of Sheshes, let's change it to Rav Ashi. Omarle, Rav Ashi, Amemer says Rav Ashi to Amemer, Kaptisu Amona. Amemer, are you makbid to use a vessel for netilas yadayim? Omarle in, he says, I am makbid. Achazusa, are you makbid to make sure that the water, in fact, looks like water and not like something putrid looking or something else? Omarle in, yes, I am makbid to make sure it looks like water. Ashiura, are you makbid to make sure that it is a revius? Omarle in, yes, I am makbid to make sure that it is a revius of water. I'm going to chop a shlick of tea. My voice is getting better. My voice is getting better, but it's not, I still have to be careful. It's not at a place where I don't need to worry about it. I'm still going through like tons of Ricolas and teas, and I'm still being careful. Akoponim, Ikadamer, those who say, this is what a Maimer says to Rav Ashi, we are careful with regard to the vessel and with regard to the color of the water. Yes, we are careful about that. Ashiura lo kaptinon, but we are not makbid about a revius. The Tani, because we learn in the Brisa, may revius noten li yadayim le'echod, that a revius is necessary for one person, and even for two people. So we see that you can have even less than a revius, because a full revius can be used for two people. Veloi, no, it's not just simply that you don't need a revius. Rather, shiny asim, it's different over there. Like we said earlier, mishum dikaasu mishiare taira. When you can have less than a revius, when you can have less than a revius, it's when there's less than a revius left from an initial whole revius, right? As we said earlier, you have two people, you start with the whole revius, you pour it within the first person, whatever is left over can then be used for the second person, but you can't simply start with less than a revius. Asking Rabbi Yaakov minar pkod, natla bas reviasa. Rabbi Yaakov in Nar Pkod, what he did was he had a vessel, a glass vessel that was the size of a revius. And if you wanted to test out if your vessel was able to hold a revius, well, he had a example revius vessel, and you would just fill it up, pour it into your vessel, and check if your vessel was able to hold, it was big enough to hold a revius. Asking Rav Ashi, but Hutzol Kuza bas reviasa, and in Hutzol, Rav Ashi had a earthenware revius that served the same purpose to test, if you want to test your vessel to see if it can hold a revius, so test it out with one of these revius measures and see, fill it up, pour it into your vessel, see if it can contain it. It says over Megufas Chav is the lid of a barrel, shetikna nothing menu liyadayim, that you kind of carved it out to be able to hold water and pour water from it. It is acceptable. Taninam Yachi, also in a price like this, Megufas Chav is the lid of a barrel, shetikna, that you fixed it, you carved it out to be able to hold water for netilas yadayim. Not limimena liyadayim, you can use it for netilas yadayim. Chemes v'chfisha, but these different types of hide vessels, shetiknon notlin mehem liyadayim. So also there, the hide vessels you can use for netilas yadayim. Sak v'kupa, but a sack or a reed basket, even if you fix them up so now they can receive water, we don't use them for netilas yadayim. We don't use a sack or a reed basket for netilas yadayim because they're not meant to hold water. Okay, now we get to the fascinating question of, can you simply wrap your hands in cloth so you simply aren't touching the bread? Genius solution, right? Let's see if that is actually a solution. Can you simply cover your hands, put on gloves or something like that, and go along your merry way, eat your tuna fish sandwich? Michashinon dilma naga, do we have to be concerned that maybe the cloth is gonna get separated? One where it's a little bit, you're playing with fire. It's a little risky. If you wash netilas yadayim, so problem solved. Your hands are not tummy anymore. There's nothing to be concerned about. Here, your mamish, your hands are still tummy. You're just kind of like that nuclear reactor in Ukraine from the Russians, right? They just covered it over, but there's a lot of real radioactive stuff over there. So in Chernobyl, where the Morinaim is from. So it's tricky, right? Your hands are still tame, but you're just kind of covering it over. Anyways, so mi chashina dilmanaga, are we concerned that you might still end up touching the bread, or maybe we're not concerned. Tashma coming here is a Mishnah in Masechta Sukkah. Uchshenasnu lo l'Reb Tzadik ochel pachos mikebeya. On Sukkos, if they would give to Reb Tzadik bread that was less than a kibeya, notlo b'mapa, he would hold it in a cloth, v'ochlo chutz the sukkah, and he would eat it outside of the sukkah, ve'emuvarich acharab, and he would not bench afterwards. Tosfos points out he would not bench afterwards because he holds like Rabbi Yehuda, who says b'chalta v'savata uverachta. You only bench if you're satisfied, which is at least a kibeya. Since it was less than a kibeya, so we're saying that he would cover it in a cloth, and he would eat it, and he would eat it outside of the sukkah, and not bench afterwards. My lab, so what's it saying? HaKibeya by netilas yadayim. So does that not imply that if it was a kibeya of bread, so then he would be unable to simply cover it with a cloth? He would have to do netilas yadayim. Dilma hakibeya by sukkah uvay bracha. No, maybe the implication is not about the netilas yadayim. It's about that if it was a kibeya, he would have to go into a sukkah. He would have to bench as well, but maybe he could still continue to eat it with the cloth. Tashma come and here the Shmuel Ashkei the Rab. Shmuel found Rab the Ka'achel b'mapa, who was eating in this manner. He was eating a sandwich and he wrapped his hands in cloth so that he wouldn't be touching the bread with his hands. Amalei, Shmuel says to Rab, Avdin Kidain, what is this? What we do? This is not what we do. To just cover our hands in cloth. Amalei, to which Rab says, no. I washed. Daiti ktsara alai. I'm overly sensitive. I simply don't want to be touching my food with my hands. So after I washed, I'm nonetheless using some kind of I'm eating with a napkin rather than touching directly with my hands, but I did, in fact, wash. Kisalik Abzer, when Reb Zera moved, made aliyah from Babble to Eretz Yisrael, Ashkachinu, Reb Ami Reb Asi, he found Reb Ami Reb Asi, the Ka'achle, Bibaloi Chamasos, that they were eating a sandwich, and they covered, and they were holding it with worn out hide containers. I.e., they were not touching the bread itself. So Omar, Reb Zera saw this. He says, "What's going on over here?" Tregavre, Ravive Kavasaichu, two great people like you, like Rabami and Rabasi, Litu b'Ravu Shmuel, would make such a glaring mistake in that incident with Rab and Shmuel. Hadaiti ktsara ka'amar. Rab responded to Shmuel and said, I did wash my hands. I just don't want to touch the bread. That's all. So Reb Zera was surprised to find Rab Ami and Rab Asi simply covering their hands rather than washing. Ishtamitze hada amar of tachlifa by Avimi amar Shmuel. However, Reb Zera missed something. He didn't realize that what Rav Tachlifa bar Avimi says, the name of Shmuel, Hetiru mapa the ochle truma. For ochle truma, for kohanim who eat truma, like Rab Ami and Rab Asi, who we're going to see in a second, they actually are allowed to simply cover their hands. As Rashi says, because the kohanim's reasoning, as we've seen in the past, that the kohanim are very meticulous and they wouldn't touch it with their hands. So kohanim taka are allowed to simply cover their hands. But other non-kohanim, even if they eat tyrus, right, chulin in the state of tyra, they would have to do netilas yadayim. Only kohanim can wrap their hands. Other people must do netilas yadayim. For Reb Ami, for Reb Asi, kohanim habu, and says the Gemara that Reb Ami and Reb Asi were in fact kohanim, which is why they were allowed to eat by simply covering their hands. And this, by the way, we can now revisit Reb Tzadik, Why did the Mishnah say that Reb Tzaddik was covering his food with, right, covering his hands and eating bread? Reb Tzaddik was also a Kohen, which explains why he was also simply covering his hands and eating bread. So Kohanim are allowed to do so, but non-Kohanim are not. And the Shulchan Aruch Taka says, look, if you're in a pickle, if you're in a shas adachak, there's mamish no water around to be able to do netilas yadayim. So yeah, you could just wrap your hand in a cloth and you can eat without netilas yadayim. But otherwise, if there's access to water, so you must wash and do netilas yadayim before eating bread. And now for the final segment of Daf Kuf Zayin of Masechta Chullin, at least as far as we're going to get, because it's Erev Shabbos. I'm not going to get quite far as I would have liked to, but we're going to get up to the next Mishnah. What if one is fed bread? So you're not even touching the food that you're eating, Bechlal. Someone's putting it in your mouth for you. Do you have to wash the netilas yadayim? Friends, what do you say? Ibaru de Asakasha, Ochel Machmas Maichil. If a person is eating by way of a feeder, a person is feeding him. Does the recipient, does the eater have to wash his hands? Netilas yadayim, Tashma Kaminir, to Rav Huna bar Schaira, Hava Kai Kamid Hamnuna. Rav Huna bar Schaira was before Rav Hamnuna, Balam le Umtza, and he cooked up some meat for Rav Hamnuna on coals, and he, as Tosfos says, he wrapped it in a shtickle broit, a little bread, v'achil, and he fed it to Rav Hamnuna. Amarle, and Rav Huna bar Schora says to Rav Hamnuna, who was now eating this Michael, Ilav de Rav Hamnuna at, if not for the fact that I know that you're the great Rav Hamnuna, lo safina loch, I wouldn't have fed you like that. My taima, what does this mean? Lab mishum desire velo naga is the point that Rav Huna bar Schora fed Rav Hamnuna because Rav Huna the feeder, knew that Rav Hamnuna, the eater, is very careful, he's very meticulous, and he wouldn't touch the bread. So let's call it Rav Huna and Rav Hamnuna. That's a little confusing. Anyways, Rav Huna was able to feed Rav Hamnuna this meat that was wrapped in bread because he knew that Rav Hamnuna was very careful and wouldn't touch the bread. So Rav Hamnuna didn't wash, but he also wasn't going to touch the bread. No, Dezariz Kadim Umshi Yade Meikara. No, Rav Hamnuna wasn't just Zahir, as Rashi points out, right at the beginning of Mesilas, he doesn't mention Mesilas Yesharim, but the Brisa from the beginning of Mesilas Yesharim, which, this leads to that and that leads to that, it says Zehirus comes before Zrizus. That, meaning Zehirus is a lower level, Zrizus is a higher level. Zehir, being careful, is not as high of a level as being sort of being able to preemptive, right? Zrizus is like preemptivity, I guess. Anyways, so Rashi points this out. So Rashi says Rav Hamnuna wasn't just cautious and guarding; he also was preemptive, i.e., milichatchila, he had already washed. So our question was, if you feed somebody bread, does he have to wash? Well, in this case, Rav Hamnuna had already washed. Okay. Tashma Kaminir, Damar Reb Zeir, says Reb Zeir, Amar Rav, Lo Yitein Adam Prusa, L'soch Piv Shel Shamish, Elim Kinyo Deabo, Shenota Yodav. A person should not put a morsel of bread into the waiter's mouth unless he knows that the waiter had already washed his hands. Vashamish Mivarich Al Kol Kos Vakos, and the waiter, if he's going to be offered something to drink, he's going to have to make a blessing for each and every time he's offered a drink, because he's not assuming that he's going to receive another offer to drink. So each time he has to make a new bracha, because there's hesech hadas in between. He took his mind off of it in between. Ve'eno mivarich al kol prusa uprusa, but he does not need to make a bracha for each morsel he is fed. Rabbi Yochanan Amar mivarich al kol prusa uprusa. Rabbi Yochanan says he does need to make a blessing on each morsel of bread that he, the waiter, is fed during his service. because he does take his mind off of it. Omar Rav Papa says, Papa B'Shlomo, the Rab Rabbi Yochanan lo kasha. So Rab and Rabbi Yochanan are not arguing when they say, right, Rab says that he does not need to make a bracha on each morsel, and Rabbi Yochanan says he does need to make a bracha on each morsel. If there is an important person at that suda, that important person is going to take care that the waiter has what to eat, and he assumes that he will receive food throughout the service, and he doesn't need to make a new bracha each time. If there is not an Adam Chashuv, an important person, however, so then he would have to make a new blessing each time, because he won't assume that he's going to continue getting morsels of food. Now, however, the Gemara points out that the Bryce had began, or Rav had began by saying that you can only feed bread to the waiter if you know that he had washed his hands. So we see that even if you're not going to be touching the food, you need to wash your hands. Shiny shamas detarid, to which we say that's not necessarily good proof. You can't really prove that from a waiter. Waiters are really busy. It's hectic. There's a lot going on, and he might just not pay attention because there's so much going on and end up touching the food. So he has to wash his hands even if he's being fed. But what about just a regular person who's being fed? Does he have to wash his hands? Maybe not. Let's explore further. I'm going to take a slurp of tea. Tanu Rabbanon, the rabbis, Toad lo yitein adam prusa l'shamish, a guest at a suda should not give food to the waiter. Ben shakos biyado, ben shakos biyado shabal habayis. Whether the waiter is holding a glass, let's say a glass of wine, or whether the bal habayis is holding a glass. Shem yera dvar takola besuda, because there's a concern that if the guest is going to be giving food to the waiter to eat, that might that might bother the host, and that could lead to shtickle balagan. The host might end up choking on his drink. Maybe the waiter will spill his drink. It create a bit of a balagan. Don't feed the waiters. You shouldn't be feeding the waiters at the suda, meaning it's not your suda. The food's for you. It's not your liberty to be giving it to other people. Vashamish shalonata yadav also a waiter who has not washed his hands, you can't stick morsels of bread into his mouth. The feeder. Okay, so if you're feeding somebody bread, does the feeder need to wash their hands? Tashma, come in here. Titani Devei Menashe was taught by the Besmedrash of Menashe. Reb Shimon ben Gamliel, Omer said Shimon Gamliel, Isha madicha es yada achas ba'moim v'nosenes pas livna koin. This is talking about Yom Kippur. We're saying that on Yom Kippur, right? So of course, one of the 5 inuyim, one of the things that we don't do on Yom Kippur is we don't rechitza. We don't wash. We don't even wash our hands on Yom Kippur. Not, certainly not past a certain point. But nonetheless, Isha madicha es yada. A woman, however, an exception is made. She can wash as yada achas, one of her hands, ba'moim, in water, v'nosenes pas livna, so that she can feed livna cotton, so that she can feed her young child. Amar olav al Shammai Azaken. They said about Shammai Azaken, shelo ratza lachil biyado achas, that he didn't want to feed with this one hand, right, and wash the hand and feed. Because all of shachal b'shtei yodav, so they made a gezerah that he, in fact, needed to feed his child on Yom Kippur. So what do we see? So we see that the feeder needs to wash their hands, right? We said that the mother who's feeding her child, Shammai, who needed to feed his child, they would have to wash their hand in order to feed somebody else, essentially. So yes, it would appear that the feeder also needs to wash their hands. Amar Abaye says, no, that's not necessarily good proof. Hasam Mishum Shivsa, there was Yom Kippur, and the concern there, well, okay, anyways, over there the concern was because of Shivsa. The question is, what does that mean, Shivsa? Rashi says, it was Yom Kippur, and they weren't washing their hands otherwise. and therefore because they weren't washing their hands, otherwise that includes netilas yadayim in the morning. They didn't wash, so there was ruach ra. There was that, right? The ruach ra, the evil spirit on their hands from when they woke up. They never washed netilas yadayim in the morning, so that's why they had to wash their hands before feeding somebody else. But anybody who washes netilas yadayim in the morning, they could feed others without having to wash their hands. There's no requirement to wash their hands otherwise. Rabbeinu Tam says in Tosfos that no, on Yom Kippur you're allowed to wash netilas yadayim in the morning to get rid of the ruach ra. Rabbeinu Tam says there's no problem with that. This was a separate concern about some kind of condition which we don't have anymore, but some kind of a condition where even if you did wash your hands in netilas yadayim in the morning, somebody who feeds like a young child, what does it say? Right, it's some evil spirit that's on the food. If you're feeding a child who's 4 or 5 years old, also, they could die, they could choke, unless you wash your hands at that exact time. So even if you wash it in the morning, some kind of condition that they had, says Tosfos back then, we don't have it anymore, right? We don't have that anymore, says Rabbeinu Tam. But they did have it, and therefore they had to be concerned about it. But that's not neither of those are necessarily proofs. Whether, according to Rashi, because it was specific to Yom Kippur, or whether Rabbeinu Tam because it's specific to 4 and 5-year-old kids. But otherwise, there's no proof that when feeding others you would have to necessarily wash your hands. Shmuel's father found him to kabachi that he, Shmuel, was crying. Amalei, his father says to him, Amai kabachis, why are you crying? Demachin Rabbi, because my Rebbe hit me. Amai, why did he hit you? The Amarli kasafis livroi. He said, how could you have fed my child without washing your hands first? So Shmuel's father asked him, why didn't you wash your hands before feeding your Rebbe's child? So Amalei, hu achil va'ana mashina, I don't understand. Why should I have to wash my hands? He's the one eating. The kid is the one eating. So Amalei, avua de Shmuel's father says, Yataka right. Lo mistayeya de lo gomir. Not only does your Rebbe not know halacha, Mimcha nami machi, he even hit you for it. Shmendrik. V'ilchasa ochel machmas maichil. Tzarchim tiasadayim, the halacha is the eater needs to wash their hands. Maichil and tzarchim tiasadayim, the feeder does not need to wash their hands. The eater needs to wash their hands. The feeder does not need to wash their hands. We're going to hold it here for Daf Kuf Zayin of Masechta Chullin. On Daf Kuf Zayin, the first section, we learned various halachos of netilas yadayim. We saw an interesting shita of Rab that you can make a tanai, a condition for the whole day. Now you can wash netilas yadayim in the morning, and that could potentially work for the whole day. There was a question of could that maybe only be b'shas adachak or not. Anyways, we then talked about an interesting scenario where a person was pouring from a bucket into a ditch, and can you plunge your hands into that ditch? Essentially, what was important was whether the force of the pouring was going to be what was landing on your hands or arriving at your hands. If the answer is yes, the force of the bucket, well then that's netilas yadayim. Otherwise, it wouldn't work because this isn't something you could be tovel your whole body, and therefore you wouldn't be able to plunge your hands in there either, unless of course the koach is coming from the vessel being poured in there. We also talked about various different baskets to use and minimum amounts of revius, that if you're washing your hands, you need to have a minimum of a revius in the vessel. If there are leftovers, it could be used for somebody else. We discussed wrapping your hands in a cloth, which is a very interesting question, right? If the whole point is that we don't want to touch the bread, so just cover your hands, and maybe you don't need to wash your hands anymore. To which the Gemara ultimately concluded, look, Kohanim, interestingly, because they are very meticulous, so they said for Kohanim, people who eat truma, i.e. Kohanim, they can use a cloth. However, everybody else cannot use a cloth. Though I wonder nowadays if that's still the case, since they're not actually eating truma, so there isn't any practical concerns for Truma Tameh necessarily. Anyways, that was that sugya. And then we had a question of if somebody's being fed bread, he's not touching it himself, somebody else is putting it in his mouth. Does he have to wash? Does he have to wash netilas yadayim? What about the feeder? Ultimately, the Gemara concludes that the person eating the bread does have to wash their hands. The person feeding the bread does not have to wash their hands. Friends, that was the Kuf Zayin of Masechta Chulin. Hope you enjoyed. Have a great day. Cheers.